Welcome to the Why Didn't I Know podcast, episode 28. I'm your host, Dr. Jenny Martin, and today we're talking about, is the DMT trip real? So let's talk about this question. Is a psychedelic trip happening in your brain? Or are you actually accessing another dimension? In popular media, in scientific journals today, you're going to get one standard answer to that question. The answer will be your brain is producing the experience. The experience of entering a DMT world that you feel is more real than waking reality, what you'll be told by the quote experts is that this is a hallucination, a delusion. Now, that response, even though it is the most common response, and it's coming from reputable universities, we need to also use our own discernment and ask, could those opinions, could that perspective be advantageous for those people working at those institutions? And let's just call a spade a spade. Pharmaceutical companies fund research in universities. They fund the research by scientists, by professors in universities to come up with the next marketable drug that they can make a fortune on. All of that requires a certain model of brain, a certain model of these experiences, a certain way of looking at how things happen in the human brain and body. Pharmaceutical companies want you to believe that you are only a physical being, and every mood you have, everything going on in your body, it's part of your biochemistry. They're not looking at us being what you could call a quantum being. Now, I've written about that on my Substack. I've talked about it a little bit here on this podcast. But there is also valid reasons, valid science to show that humans do not just operate on the level of the material reality, physical reality. We actually are vibration. We have biochemistry, but there is layers deeper than our biochemistry that is coordinating all of those processes. Now, that is not going to be talked about openly in science journals, in universities, because the ones paying the bill, the pharmaceutical companies, don't want that perspective to be talked about because it undermines their ability to have a pill for every ill, so to speak. It undermines their ability to convince the general public that all they need to do is take this next medicine and everything will be okay. If we were really viewed as being vibrational beings run by a life force energy, which I have talked about a bit on this podcast, if we are viewed in that way, then the pharmaceutical companies would need to, if they wanted to stay in the business of healing. I was going to say healing, but they don't heal. They never promise to heal. They promise to manage symptoms. Pharmaceutical companies don't promise to heal. But if they were to stay in that business, they would have to switch to energy medicine. Now, the problem with energy medicine, it doesn't fit the same money-making pursuit that they have, because energy medicine would heal you. You wouldn't have to keep getting sick, and it would heal you beyond the level of symptoms. So it's not going to be profitable. Now, I have written about on my Substack the fact that in the United States, at a certain point in our history, there was as many doctors practicing energy medicine as there were allopathic doctors. It was a way of thinking by the general public that it was acceptable. It wasn't on the fringe. It wasn't woo-woo. But a guy came along, Rockefeller, who made his fortune in oil, and he had realized at that point, when he decided to move to medicine, that oil, a derivative of oil called petrochemicals, could be used to make pills. And he knew that he could make a fortune in pharmaceutical industry. The only problem was that at least half of the population at the time didn't want anything to do with allopathic medicine. They knew that they could get healed permanently with energy medicine. So Rockefeller had to do something to shift the way of thinking in the country, that he could make his petrochemical pharmaceuticals and have more willingness to buy into that medical model. And so he hired a guy who was a teacher working in education to do a, quote, comprehensive report on medical schools across the country, showing, or at least concocting the story, that they were not based in science. Now, that wasn't accurate, but this report, called the Flexner Report, discredited any school that wasn't part of the allopathic system. And the Flexner Report was presented to Congress. And then Congress voted. And in the subsequent years, 75% of the schools teaching an alternative, and it wasn't called an alternative at that point, which is interesting. It was not alternative. It was a well-accepted way of healing. But those schools that were not teaching allopathic medicine in the subsequent years, the vast majority closed, because to be a doctor in the United States, it became mandated that you only were credentialed if you went through the allopathic system. And so there was a systematic PR move by someone who had the resources to do it, Rockefeller, to change the way the American public viewed health and healing. And with that came this dramatic shift in viewing the body as only physical, viewing the body as run by chemicals, not vibration. And that has trickled down today when researchers are doing research on psychedelics. There's only one acceptable view, and that is that these experiences are happening in the brain. And that is called consensus thinking, when if you had an alternative point of view, it would be hard to get published in a reputable journal today, scientific journal. If you wanted to do a different type of research, it'd be difficult to get funding in the university system. And why is that? This consensus thinking that is run by profit, it is motivated to keep, people are motivated to keep their jobs, very understandably, but it creates a group think. And that's the antithesis of science. Science is about questioning, experimentation, pushing the envelope, looking at new ways of seeing things. And if we have a foregone conclusion that these experiences are happening in the brain, then we are blocking scientific progress. Now, I had someone reach out to me recently, and I have permission to share their story, and it shows how damaging this whole perspective is. So this person, we'll call him Jack, is a pretty straight-cut person working on Wall Street, investment banker, doesn't really have time for any of woo-woo stuff, supernatural stuff. But here he took a trip to South America, and one thing led to another. He hadn't planned this, but he ended up not only on an ayahuasca retreat, but also taking DMT, and had not really been prepared for the dramatic shift in perception. But what was even more strange to him was that entering this other dimensional reality felt more real than waking reality. And so when the trip was over, he was grateful that his perception adjusted to, quote, waking reality. But something began to happen, though, when he was on the plane back home, and then for a couple of weeks until he took some action. What ended up happening was he was walking down the street, he was talking to his partner, and he's seeing this aura around people. Some people looked brighter, some people it was more faint, but he had never seen anything like that before, and he didn't even believe that that was possible. And so this was really bothering him, interfering with his ability to keep his mind on his work. He had never had a mental illness. There's no mental illness in his family, but he couldn't shake this shift in the way he was seeing people. So he found a psychiatrist and showed up at the office to talk about this. And the psychiatrist doesn't have a worldview to understand that we can access other dimensions. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor trained in Western science that is rooted in what we call materialism. Materialism is the philosophy that is based on the idea that what is material, what is physical, is all that exists. If we can't explain it in terms of a material or physical idea, then it is not real. So when you're talking about an aura around people, that in the psychiatrist's view is a sign of psychosis. So here's this person, very rational man who went on a DMT trip by taking a trip to South America, now has his perception altered and has nobody to talk him through this, to help him to understand a worldview that is different than this consensus worldview that we're only physical beings. So he has no one to talk about this with, and he looks for help in a psychiatrist. And a psychiatrist is going to come to one conclusion. That is, your brain is producing this experience, so there's something wrong with your brain, and we need to give you medicine to help you deal with the problem with your brain. And so this person ends up on antipsychotic medication, which, if you've ever looked into that, there is a myriad of side effects that these things produce that are almost worse than the actual original reason you were taking the medicine. So that's this individual that contacted me, and I can't help but thinking that if they were living in another country, grew up in, for instance, in Peru all their life, they wouldn't have come to the conclusion that they were losing grip on reality. They would have come to the conclusion that their third eye is opening, their pineal gland is opening, that they're able to see into the spirit world. And that people have energy auras. These things can actually be scientifically measured by different scientific methods that are not allowed or not acknowledged in the United States of America, but in other countries of the world, they are. So if this person who ended up on antipsychotic medicine had a different worldview that he grew up with, he might have been able to cope with this differently. Not to say that people do not struggle with real mental illnesses. That's a whole other category, but we're talking about someone that was completely in touch with reality, had no problems with his mind until he did psychedelics. And so that's in its own category. And what happened with this individual is a lack of understanding of what the world is really all about by Western medicine. And it's not just ignorance. It is fueled by a motive to keep us ignorant of this fact so that we can buy into this capitalistic pharmaceutical industry system. As I mentioned, at one time in the United States of America, it was very common to deal with issues in the spiritual realm, to deal with issues from an energetic level, and we didn't have this sense that the mind is cut off from the body and that there is no spirit world. There was much more of an integration with those things. Now, what is looked upon today as being intelligent is, okay, you're a scientist, you're a hardcore scientist, and you don't have time for the mystical. That's woo-woo, that's not logical. But really, that is an inaccurate understanding of how science came to be. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, a key figure in the time period that motivated the scientific revolution is Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton, who lived 1642 to 1727, who's considered the founder of modern science, he didn't have this either or thinking that I could either be into the supernatural or into reason and logic. His belief in the divine, his belief in intelligent design, in God, fueled his intellectual curiosity. And the more that he learned about physics, the more that he invented math, he invented calculus, the more that he worked on these left brain, logical, reasoned out ways of viewing the world, the more that he had a sense of awe and wonder that there was most definitely a divine higher power that was responsible for bringing all of this into existence and continuing to support life as we know it on Earth. Newton didn't believe that the world was created by the divine and then the divine checked out of the world, he believed that the divine was very much still in the world in terms of a life force energy. The point here being that the scientific revolution was motivated by someone who didn't have this type of black and white thinking, that you're either looking at a psychedelic experience, for instance, as being produced in the brain, and that's a very logical view, or you're taking the perspective that you are accessing another dimension, and then you are just flat out not a logical human. Now, Newton wasn't investigating psychedelics. Interestingly enough, Newton actually studied and wrote about alchemy, ancient alchemy, more than he did about any of the other topics. He brought us the understanding of the law of gravity. He brought us understanding that there's a whole electromagnetic spectrum in white light. The understanding of the rainbow. He brought us the telescope. He brought us so many different things. But what Newton was actually fascinated by was alchemy. Now, when I say alchemy, a lot of people think that that means turning a metal into a gold, or they might think about Harry Potter. But alchemy, when we go back to ancient Egypt, when we go back to Mary the prophetess, who's the first alchemist, that we have her writings through a Greek Zoroaster who quoted her extensively. The original alchemy being about recognizing that there is an invisible force, a divine force that connects the invisible and visible worlds. There was a professor at Northwestern University. Her name was Betty Jo Teeter. She spent a good portion of her career just studying Isaac Newton's work on alchemy. He wrote more than 1 million words on alchemy. And she studied this. And she made a presentation a couple decades ago at the Smithsonian Institute. And a book came from that, a small booklet. And she was making a presentation about alchemy and Newton. And in that book, she says this, she says, it was Newton's conviction that the passive particles of matter could not organize themselves into living forms. Their organization required divine guidance. The latent spirit, he said, was in all things. And this vital spirit links the invisible world, the spiritual world, and the world of matter. So with ancient alchemy that Newton was so fascinated with, it bridged the world of science and spirit. There wasn't a trade-off. That trade-off wasn't required. And in Newton's thinking, not only was the trade-off between having to ditch science to be interested in this invisible world, not only was that not necessary, to him it wasn't thinkable. It was unthinkable. Because to really truly understand and appreciate and invent new scientific means, you had to hold this sense of awe and this larger picture. And there's a humility in that, but also it spurs on his intellectual curiosity to discover and to find new things and to realize that our world is magical, not in a sense of Harry Potter magical, but there is far more to our human body than we have been told. And this vital force, this life force energy has been studied by science, classified science at intelligence agencies, not mainstream. And reason why it's not acceptable in mainstream universities, not that it's not real, not that it doesn't explain a lot, not that it can't be measured, but because it would upend the system that is run by profit, that has us use pills and medicines for a physical body. All of these pills are operating at the level of the physical, not at the energetic level of the human. And they don't solve and cure the illness. They manage the symptoms. And that's a better model for profit. Now, that might sound super cynical. I do believe in God. I do believe there's divine order in the world. And I do believe with so many people waking up to such realities as I've just mentioned, that we are going to see in our lifetime, in the next actual short number of years, a turning back to the ancient wisdom that people once knew. Awareness that we have a lot more to us than just being a physical material being run by chemicals. Not that biochemistry isn't important, not that our physical being and vehicle isn't important and we don't have to take care of it. We absolutely do. But to get to an understanding of, for instance, what is going on in a psychedelic trip, whether it's produced by orgasm, whether it's produced by a plant, what is going on in a psychedelic trip? If we are told that this is simply a hallucination produced by your mind, what are the implications of that? The implications are you are more likely to end up thinking you're going crazy and then end up on an antipsychotic, which is a very sad outcome for anybody. You're living as a zombie on these medicines, as opposed to us teaching people that you aren't just a physical being. You've always had a connection to a mystical world. Now you need to learn about that. You need to steward that, because it's not about floating off to another dimension. It's about having your feet on the ground, being able to be a functional member of society, paying bills, doing all the practical things of life, as has been stated, after enlightenment, do the laundry, to be able to function at that level of practical everyday life, which isn't always rosy. We have our trials and tribulations, but if we can understand and glimpse these other realities from time to time, which is what psychedelics offer us, but which is also what a sacred view of sex offers us too. If we can glimpse these other dimensions from time to time and integrate that into our daily life, then we don't get sucked into all the drama that's going on in the world. And if there's something bad that happens in our life, and bad is very subjective, I realize, but if there's something devastating that happens in our lives, we bring this mystical perspective to it, so that the event doesn't crush us, so that we can actually live in the world but not of it, which is an easy sentence to say, I realize, but I believe looking at all of this from a spiritual perspective is the divine, God, whatever you want to call it, gave us the plants, gave us sex, to be able to steward wisely, not just to go off into a drunken orgy and things like that. Not that group sex has anything wrong with it, but the point is, whether it's a plant medicine, whether it's sex, these things can be used very unconsciously and just for pleasure or just recreationally, without any awareness of a higher purpose. If it's just about the recreation, there won't be a soothing of the soul. There won't be a sense of satisfaction at a deep soul level. It requires us to actually have a sense that I'm doing this to honor my spiritual life. But again, we come back to this whole thing. If we are told that these experiences are just happening in our brain, they are just a hallucination, that is much more difficult to integrate that perspective, that interpretation, into growing spiritually. What we need to look at is an understanding of us being spiritual beings first. And there's many different teachers of mysticism. The Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, those have enriched my life to understand that the God, even in Western religion, is not a materialistic God. It is a God that imbues itself, that is part of all living things. And in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Mary, at the very beginning of the first page, it says, "What is matter?" And she has this dialogue with the risen Jesus, and they're talking about that matter is part of this circle of life. It's not you have a physical body, you die, and that's the end of it. They're talking about in the Gospel of Mary that matter exists before it exists in physical form, and it continues to exist after physical form. Now, I'm certainly paraphrasing, but you see this quantum reality existing right there in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Now, if you don't have that type of perspective and you end up in a psychiatrist's office after a psychedelic experience, you can really feel like you're losing grip on reality. But that's why we need to come back to some kind of mystical training, to be a student of some kind of mystical literature, not to be bound by it, not to be dictated by it and to have to follow rules and regulations. That's a perception of religion being controlling. But when we study ancient mystical literature, it starts to piece together for our soul, for our mind, a worldview that is sorely lacking in today's world. One implication of this worldview is that you could never harm another person. You can never harm another person when you realize that we're connected at this quantum level, that we're not just matter, that we are energy. So that perspective informs the way you live, because not only do you realize this logically, but you actually start to live into that as a being. And you realize that when you help another person, when you think good thoughts about them, your own vibration is lifted. So this is not just something that is theoretical. You can feel it in your body when you're acting in a certain way that's beneficial to another person. You can feel it. And once you start dropping into your body and feeling your own connection to this life force energy, you feel different if you are holding a certain thought of negativity towards another person, or even take really harmful action towards them. If you start to become aware of the energy in your body, you can feel that shift and the consequence that it makes on you. So to be able to live with this deeper understanding, I would say, is the definition of sanity. The definition of insanity would be walking around in the world thinking that we're all separate, thinking that if I access a mystical reality, that it's just a delusion of my mind. That is not a realistic way of looking at it, to think that we are just these physical beings. There's a lot more to us. And this goes back in ancient times, in Egypt, where a lot of this alchemy comes from. They were very technologically advanced, and they didn't have a materialistic view of the world. They had a view that there was this life force energy. That was the root of this alchemy understanding. I will leave that with you for this episode. Thank you for joining me. Please leave a rating for this podcast if it's been helpful for you. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.